USA, 1962. An American of Italian descent named Tony Vallelonga works as a waiter and bouncer in one of the prestigious nightclubs in New York. A fight breaks out in the club, and Tony takes out one of the drunken patrons. The visitor threatens his connections and tries to hit Tony, but Tony easily defeats the upstart. After finishing their shift, Tony and a few other waiters discuss the club closing for renovations and their plans for this period. Tony comes home in the morning and goes to bed. He is awakened by a noise from the living room. His friends are watching a baseball game and cheering loudly. When asked by Tony why they're here so early, his friends reply that Tony's wife Dolores called the Black Plumbers and they've come to keep an eye on them. Dolores treats the plumbers to lemonade, and Tony, seeing all this, throws the glasses in the trash. Tony is sitting in the kitchen and the phone rings. His friend offers him a part-time job as a driver while the club is closed for repairs. Tony accepts and writes down the address. Tony arrives at the interview site, which is on the second floor of the Opera House. After Tony finishes filling out the form, he meets a black pianist named Dr. Donald Shirley, or just Doc. Doc says he's going on tour to the southern states and needs a driver who can solve problems. Doc offers Tony a pay of $100 a week and adds that his duties will also include washing clothes, shoe shining, and other chores that Tony considers beneath his dignity. Tony says that driving with a black man doesn't bother him, but he won't do any servant work, whereupon he leaves Doc's office. Annoyed by the thwarted interview, Tony goes to a bar, and a local criminal authority crosses to approach him. The gangster reports that he was able to smooth things over with the guy Tony beat up outside the club. After that, he offers Tony a job, obviously connected with crime, but Tony refuses, saying that he is now all right with money. But in the very next scene, Tony pawns his watch. The next morning, Doc calls Tony's house and asks him to put Dolores on the phone. Doc asks permission to take her husband on a trip for 2 months until just before Christmas, and Dolores gives the okay. Dolores walks her husband on the road. She asks Tony to write her letters and gives him 2 sandwiches for Tony and Dr. Shirley. Arriving at the Opera House, Tony meets the musicians of the Doc Trio, cellist Oleg and bassist George. Doc's colleagues give Tony a map of the area and the Green Book, a list of hotels, restaurants, and stores where blacks are allowed to stay. On his way to Pittsburgh, the first city on the itinerary, Doc reminds Tony to make sure the concert venues have the Steinway grand piano specified in his contract and a bottle of Cutty Sark whiskey in his room every night. Tony doesn't like the tone in which Doc speaks to him, and he retaliates by eating a sandwich that Dolores has made for Doc. Arriving at the concert venue, Tony watches Doc's virtuoso playing and then goes to play dice with the local servants. Doc is not happy that Tony did not come to the concert because he had such an opportunity unlike the others. On the way to Ohio, Tony turns on the radio, which plays songs by famous black jazzmans, but Doc doesn't know any of them. Tony stops the car near a roadside store and, noticing a rock that has fallen off the counter, puts it in his pocket. Doc, who notices this, says they're not going anywhere until Tony returns the stolen item. Tony objects that it is not theft, but still goes to the counter and puts the stone back. Arriving in Hanover, Indiana, Tony notices that the technician has installed some old piano with trash inside instead of a Steinway. Tony calls out to the technician and demands that he install the correct piano. The technician starts to lash out at Tony, but the famous Italian slap quickly settles the matter. On the way to Kentucky, Tony and Doc chat about life. Doc reveals that he is all alone. His wife left him because of his constant touring, and he hasn't seen his brother in a couple of years. Tony decides to cheer Doc up by buying chicken from KFC and offering to eat a piece because he thinks all blacks love fried chicken, corn, and cabbage. Doc refuses, saying he's never eaten anything like it, but after a bit of coaxing, he agrees. Doc enjoys the food, despite the unhygienic nature of eating with his hands. The travelers arrive at a hotel in Louisville. The hotel is not in the best condition, besides clearly being in a disadvantaged neighborhood. Tony leaves for another hotel, as this one is for colored people only. While sipping whiskey outside his room, one of the hotel guests offers Doc a game of horseshoes. Doc declines, as he is not accustomed to such base amusements, and citing that he has a meeting with a friend, goes away. Lying in his room, Tony kisses a picture of his wife and places it near the rock he picked up earlier. Deciding to make a small snack before going to bed, he is interrupted by a knock at the door. George informs him that Doc is in trouble. Tony runs with the bassist to a local bar where a group of racists are bullying Doc, who has gotten pretty drunk. Tony demands to let him go, but the racists reply that they will only let him go after they beat him up pretty badly. Tony puts his hand behind his back, saying that either they leave with Doc now or he will put a bullet in them. The racists don't believe Tony has a gun, but their conflict is interrupted by a bartender with a shotgun, saying he definitely has one, and letting Doc go on his way. Tony reprimands Doc for going to a bar in one of the southern states. Doc replies that geography doesn't matter because New York would have been the same. After playing another gig, they head to North Carolina. Arriving at the concert venue, the host is having a banquet before the main show. He says he asked the cooks what they thought Don Shirley would like, and opens a tray of fried chicken and corn. Doc doesn't like it, but he doesn't let on. In the middle of the concert, the musicians take a short intermission, and Doc goes to the restroom. But the organizer of the event stops him and says he can't go in there and points to the toilet outside. Doc says that in that case he will go to a motel and use the restroom there, but it will take about half an hour, and organizer agrees to this. After the concert, Tony talks to George and Oleg. Tony marvels at how he can talk to them calmly and shake their hands after what they've done, and adds that if he'd been chased into that toilet, he'd have pissed on the floor. Oleg says that Doc could have played in New York where he would have been paid 3 times as much and kissed ass. But Doc asked for this tour himself. On the way to Georgia, Tony and Doc stop at a roadside cafe for lunch, and Doc asks to read what Tony is writing in letters for his wife. Realizing that Tony is completely inept at writing letters, he helps him write a lovely romantic letter, much to Dolores's delight. Arriving in another town, Tony and Doc go into an atelier to try on a suit that Doc likes, but the owner says he is not allowed to try on and asks him to buy one of the ready-made suits. An angry Doc leaves the atelier and plays a concert that night, this time playing particularly aggressively. After the concert, Tony gets a call to his room saying that Doc is in trouble again. Tony arrives at the pool and notices a naked Doc along with one guy in the shower room handcuffed together. Tony tries to smooth things over and bribes the cops by telling them to buy a suit, and the cops let them go. On the way to the next town, Tony goes off the road and they are pulled over by the cops. The officer says that blacks can't be here at this hour as they have a sunset rule. The cop asks why Tony is driving and not a black man, to which Tony replies that he is his boss. A policeman asks for Tony's ID, and noticing Tony's unusual last name, asks about it. Tony replies that it is Italian. The policeman says he realized why he's riding a black man since he's half black himself, and Tony punches him in the face. Tony and Doc are taken to the police station, and Doc starts demanding a phone call. He is allowed to make the call, and a few minutes later, the president calls the police station and demands that they be released, or the National Guard will be here in half an hour. They are released, and Doc starts reprimanding Tony for not being able to stand the insults Doc has listened to all his life. Tony says that he will be blacker than Doc and can take offense at such words. After all, Doc lives in his palace playing music for the rich white people and knows no grief, while he has to scrape by every day to feed his family. Doc demands Tony stop the car and gives an emotional speech about how he lives in the palace all alone and white rich people pay him to play for them, but when he comes down off the stage, he is a nobody again. And he carries this burden despised even by black people. Tony is impressed by such an emotional speech, and they reconcile. Tony and Doc arrive at the restaurant at the site of the Christmas concert. The manager greets Doc and escorts him to his dressing room, which looks more like a storage room. Meanwhile, George, Oleg, and Tony are chatting while sitting at a table. Doc finishes his preparations and goes into the hall to join his friends. But he is stopped by a waiter and told he can't come in here. Tony and the manager come over to see what's going on. The manager says he can't come in here and suggests Doc eat in the dressing room. But Doc gives an ultimatum. Either he eats in the hall or the concert is canceled. Trying to resolve the conflict, the manager asks Tony to step aside and offers him money, saying that everything has a price. Tony pushes the manager against the wall, but Doc stops him, saying that if Tony wishes, he'll eat in the pantry and play the concert back. But Tony says they're out of here. Tony and Doc head to a local black cafe called the Orange Bird. They have dinner and the bartender, surprised by such unusual guests, asks who they will be. Tony says Doc is the best pianist in the world, and the bartender asks him to play something. Doc sits down at the piano and shows a skill worthy of a true virtuoso. A little later, other jazz musicians join him and Doc plays with them, improvising. Tony and Doc go to New York, trying to get home in time for Christmas. An exhausted Tony says he's falling asleep on the road and suggests they stop at a nearby motel. But he is replaced by Doc, who gets into the driver's seat and drives him straight home. Tony suggests that Doc go to his house and meet his family, but Doc wishes him a Merry Christmas and leaves. Arriving home, Doc lets his butler go to his family for Christmas. Sitting all alone, he looks at the stone that Tony took and decides to act. Tony meets the family at home, and one of the guests is asked to tell them how he worked for the eggplant. But Tony interrupts him, asking him not to call Doc that. The doorbell rings and Tony goes to open the door, where he sees the pawn shop owner and invites him in. Almost closing the door, he notices Doc standing at the doorstep. Tony invites him inside and introduces him to the guests. Dolores arrives and Doc thanks her for letting her husband go with him. In return, Dolores thanks Doc for his help with the letters.